I can tell you exactly when the room stopped feeling like a wedding and started feeling like a test. The jazz trio was smoothing out a familiar standard. Candles were lifting small, warm halos over polished silver, and everyone at table 8 had their good manners on. I had my hand around my grandson Jamie's little fingers, the ones that still go clammy when he is nervous, and I was trying to keep my smile steady for him. He leaned into me and spoke so softly I felt it more than I heard it. "Grandma, can we leave right now?" I brushed the hair off his forehead and told him we would take a breath together. Then he asked the second question that knocked the air out of me. "Did you look under the table?" There was no drama in his voice, only a quiet urgency that felt older than 7. I lifted the white cloth and let my eyes adjust to the dim space between chair legs and shoes. A small square of folded paper sat by Jamie's sneaker. It was not much bigger than a place card. I reached for it, feeling the way my hands start to cool when adrenaline enters the room. I kept my face plain and untroubled for Jamie and slipped the paper into my palm. The candles made a shifting light across the letters as I opened it. The handwriting looked quick, the kind of script you use when you want to be efficient and not noticed. The words were simple. Table 8. Add shrimp to the child's serving. The room did not tilt. It did not need to. I felt the shape of the EpiPen through the lining of my purse and pressed my thumb against it. It was there. It was ready. He was not alone. Jamie watched my eyes, searching for the truth I would not say out loud. I told him we were safe at our table and asked him to show me the car he had tucked into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a little red sedan with chipped paint and rolled it across the edge of his napkin. When a server glided by with a platter of shrimp canapés, I smiled and said we would pass, then placed my water glass closer to Jamie's plate like a small wall. The trio finished the song. New laughter lifted from the far side of the room where the wedding party was posing by the floral arch. I looked for my son Mason and found him near the head table with a glass raised. His face was wide open with relief, the kind of expression you only see after a long stretch of lonely evenings. He had believed that this ceremony would start a new chapter for all of us. The bride, Nina, stood at his side, hand tucked into his elbow, profile turned to the camera. Nice dress, perfect hair, the kind of smile a person learns from years of PR lunches. From across the room, she looked like a magazine page. From where I sat, her smile did not reach her eyes. I wanted to be the grandmother who worries too much and is wrong. I wanted to be the woman who misread a clumsy kitchen note. I read the paper again anyway and felt my stomach pull tight. I told Jamie we were going to make a tiny plan. He would stay by me. He could keep the little red car right on the table tonight. He could tell me if any plate looked wrong or smelled like the ocean. He nodded, serious and brave. A waiter in a black vest stopped to refill water, and I used that gentle beat to rise. I told Jamie and my daughter Tessa, who sat across from him, that I would be right back. Tessa touched my wrist and looked at my face in the way daughters do when they want to read the full story. I tucked the note under my napkin and walked to the service station near the bar, where the banquet captain was directing trays. I introduced myself and asked for a quick word. He leaned in, and I kept my voice even. A child at table 8 has a life-threatening shellfish allergy. Someone sent a handwritten change that says to add shrimp to his plate. Please flag table 8 as no shellfish across the entire line and pull anything that could cross contact. He said of course, and called out to the kitchen with a clean urgency that made me grateful for people who do their jobs well. I asked who had the authority to insert handwritten changes. He said runners sometimes deliver cards from guests to the pass, and he would find the staffer who handled this one. I thanked him and turned back to the ballroom. The band had started a waltz. The photographer was herding cousins into a posed stack by the cake. My purse felt heavier from the EpiPen and the truth I was carrying. I sat and took Jamie's hand again. We breathed in for 4 and out for 6. We counted quietly together. The captain crossed the floor toward the kitchen with a focused stride. The entree would be plated soon. I told myself we would leave if I saw one more wrong thing. I told myself we would not make a scene unless we had to. I told myself we were going to check, and then we were going to act. The thing about danger in a ballroom is that it wears a tuxedo like everyone else. It keeps perfect time with the music and says please and thank you. From our table, I could hear the soft rattle of flatware being set for the entree and the sigh of the espresso machine at the bar. I kept Jamie close and watched the servers move in a practiced pattern that would be beautiful if I was not counting every tray that carried the pink curve of shrimp on crushed ice. The banquet captain returned with a clipboard tucked under his arm and a small radio clipped to his belt. He spoke in a low professional tone and confirmed that he had flagged table 8 as a strict no shellfish order. He said he marked it in the system and at the hotline, and he would hold the shrimp service until the main course was down. He asked if I wanted the kitchen to send a separate plate from a clean pan for the child. I told him yes, and thanked him for taking this seriously. I asked if there was a way to see when the handwritten instruction hit the pass so I could understand the timeline. He nodded and said the timestamps print on the dupe and he would pull it. I slid the folded note back into my purse and put my palm on Jamie's back. His breathing had settled into a small, steady rhythm. Tessa leaned in and asked if she should take Jamie to the lobby for a minute. I told her to stay because staying lets children see that the adults are not running away. I told Jamie he could keep his red car on the table and build a little parking lot with the butter packets. He smiled at the idea, and I felt the room give us a few inches of space. Across the hall, the photographer arranged Nina and her friends into a perfect diagonal. You could feel the performance of it from here. Chin turn, shoulder angle, laugh on cue. She looked beautiful, which is not the same as kind. Mason lifted his glass again for another toast. He thanked the team at his office for coming. He thanked older relatives for traveling. He thanked Nina for making him believe in a future that looked like family again. The words landed, and the guests applauded, and I tried to let the applause wash over me without washing away my focus. A tray appeared at my right shoulder with small porcelain spoons, cupping a single shrimp in a citrus glaze. The server was young and eager. I smiled and asked him to please take the tray away from table 8 because we have a serious allergy at the table. He nodded quickly and moved on. I watched a second server adjust his route without prompting and felt a little thread of gratitude pull tight. Precautions are not paranoia when you know the stakes. The captain returned with a thin strip of thermal paper. He pointed to a line with a time and the words, Table 8 child add shrimp handwritten. He said a runner dropped it at the pass and a line cook left it near the printer, but the expediter caught the mismatch with the original ticket and set it aside. He said a handwritten override is unusual and they plan to ignore it without a supervisor's sign-off. I thanked him and asked if he recognized the handwriting. He shook his head and said the runner might know who handed it over. My eyes skimmed the room for slate blue satin because I remembered seeing that color near the bar earlier when I stood to speak with the captain. I could not swear it meant anything. The jazz trio shifted to an old waltz, and the first wave of entree began to circulate. The smell of seared beef moved through the room. I watched each plate that crossed our line of sight and made a small, private decision that we would not take the first plate that landed. We would watch one go to another table first and confirm it was as described. Jamie asked if he could hold the EpiPen case, and I told him he could touch it for a second and then it would go back in my purse because grown-ups carry the tools. He nodded and seemed taller from the knowing. Tessa poured him water and showed him how to breathe in through his nose and out through his mouth. He copied her, and the two of them looked like a tiny meditation class in formal wear. The captain spoke into his radio, and a young server peeled off from the bar to join him. He introduced the young man as Derek and asked him to tell me how the note reached the kitchen. Derek glanced at me, then at Jamie, and swallowed in the way people do when they realize a small thing they carried might be a part of a large thing. He said a woman had passed him the folded card near the bar with a quick please and thank you and told him it was for the chef. He said she wore a slate blue dress and a thin silver bracelet that clicked lightly when she moved. He looked toward the side of the room where the bridesmaids were gathering for a bouquet photo. The captain asked if he could point her out. Derek lifted his hand and started to indicate a face at the edge of the group. Derek's finger hovered in the air like a compass that has finally found north. The woman in slate blue was at the far edge of the bridesmaids, half turned to the camera, laughing at something no one would remember tomorrow. Her bracelet flashed when she tucked hair behind her ear. I did not know her name yet, but I recognized the shape of the moment. There is a choice that comes when you see the edge of a truth. You can look away and hope it smooths itself out, or you can look directly at it and accept that things will change. I thanked Derek and told him he did the right thing by telling us who handed him the card. I asked the captain to keep the kitchen locked on our allergy note, and he nodded with steady eyes. Then I sat and let my hand rest between Jamie's shoulder blades. The way his breath rose and fell reminded me of another small chest, another night, another kitchen light left on until morning. Before the ceremony, I had driven Jamie past the playground where his mother used to bring him after preschool. The swings were quiet, and the slide was a little dull from winter. He had stared through the window and told me he remembered the blue bucket that never left the sandbox. His mother, Grace, kept a plastic knife in her purse to cut fruit into tiny squares. She would cut the apple skin in a long spiral, then make a small fan of slices on a napkin like she was plating dessert at a nice restaurant. She was practical and playful at the same time, and I still catch myself saving the little end piece of a banana because she liked that part best. On the day we buried her, it rained so hard the gutters overflowed and the church had to stack towels by the narthex so people would not slip. Mason stood with his head down and his hands open at his sides like a boy who has lost his homework and cannot explain why. He told me he would build a safe life for his son. He said it in a voice that did not have room for any more promises. For a while he kept it. He made dinners that were mostly toast and eggs, and he learned how to fix the thing under the sink that leaks when the dishwasher runs. He read Jamie the same truck book 3 times in a row, and he did not complain. Then one season melted into the next, and loneliness did what loneliness does. It made big ideas look like solutions. That was the season he met Nina. When Mason brought Nina over for Sunday chili, she complimented the paint color in my kitchen and asked what brand of vanilla I used in the cornbread. She remembered names, and she looked people in the eyes. The first time Jamie reached for my hand instead of hers, I watched the tiniest shadow pass over her face. It was gone in a blink. I told myself I was being unfair. I told myself a blended family is learned, not born, and learning takes time. Tessa knew better before I did. She is not biological. She is mine because we chose each other, because the world tossed us together when she was a college kid between programs, and I was a woman who still had a full pantry and an extra bedroom and the willingness to say stay if you need to. She is steady and kind, and sometimes that combination makes people underestimate her. She watched Jamie go quiet whenever Nina entered a room. She watched Nina change tone like a radio dial when adults left the space, and it was just her and Jamie at the table. She told me what she saw, and I asked for patience, which is what parents ask for when the truth does not fit the story they want. The servers laid down the first 2 plates at our table, and I studied the gravy as if the answer to everything might be floating in the shine. Tessa slid the plates down one setting to create a buffer. I thanked her with a look. Across the room, the bridesmaids broke formation and drifted toward the bar. Slate Blue lifted a flute of champagne. The bracelet clicked. Derek shifted near the service station like he wanted to disappear and also wanted to finish what he started. I stood and caught the eye of an usher who had been running interference for the photographer all night. I asked if he could quietly invite the woman in slate blue to speak with the banquet captain for a moment about a kitchen question. He went with a quick nod and returned with her a minute later. Up close, she was even younger than I expected, and her mascara had smudged slightly from tears that did not look fresh. She introduced herself as Kara and said she was the bride's sister. She looked from my face to Jamie's face to the captain's clipboard, and I watched the calculation happen behind her eyes. She asked what this was about in a voice that tried to be casual. I told her we were trying to keep a child safe, and that a folded card had been delivered to the kitchen, asking to add shrimp to his plate. I asked if she had carried a note to a server. Her fingers lifted to touch her bracelet, as if it were a talisman. She nodded in a small motion that looked like someone learning a new way to say yes. She said her sister handed her the paper and asked her to pass it to the chef as a personal request for a special touch. She said she did not read it because it felt like wedding business, and she was trying to be helpful. She swallowed, and her voice fell to almost a whisper. She asked if a mistake had been made. I thanked her for telling the truth. I told the captain we would need the timestamps from the printer and any camera angles that covered the bar handoff. Then I asked Kara if she would step into the foyer where it was quieter. I did not want a scene. I wanted precision. We walked past a table of cousins comparing centerpieces and a great-aunt arguing kindly about which side of the family makes the better pound cake. At the foyer doorway, Kara stopped and rubbed a thumb over a small smudge near her hem, like she needed to fix one thing she could control. I asked her if Nina had said why the note mattered. Kara blinked and looked at the double doors that led back to the ballroom. She said her sister told her the kitchen needed to know that the child at our table should get a special plate because he was family, and family should feel included. It was an answer that sounded warm if you did not know the context. I let the silence hang just long enough for the idea to rattle. Then I told her the context. I told her about Jamie's allergy and the EpiPen, and the way handwritten changes can slip past a system that is otherwise careful. Her face went pale in a clean wash. She whispered that she would never have carried the paper if she had known. She said Nina would never hurt a child. She said it again and pinched the bridge of her nose like a person trying to wake up from the wrong dream. Behind us, the band shifted songs, and the MC tapped the microphone to prepare the room for the main course. Inside my chest, a metronome clicked from patience to action. I thanked Kara for her help and told her we were going to verify every step. I told her that the truth has a way of holding whether or not people want to hold it. She nodded and asked if she could stay nearby in case we needed her to repeat what she saw. I said yes and walked back toward table 8 with the same steady pace I use when a child is sick and the medicine is ready on the counter. Mason looked up as I approached. He started to smile, and then he saw my face, and the smile fell. He asked if everything was all right. I told him it could be if we kept our heads and did the work. I set my purse on the chair and slid the folded note under the water glass like a marker on a map. The captain lifted his radio and told the kitchen to hold the plates at table 8 for 60 seconds. The MC lifted his hand for quiet. The room obeyed. I stood and felt the weight of every person who ever stood in front of their family and chose to speak when it would have been easier to sit. I did not raise my voice. I raised my hand. The MC paused, and the trio let the last note hang just long enough for the room to settle. Thank you for giving me a moment. Before anyone eats, I need to clarify something about food safety at table 8. A child at this table has a life-threatening shellfish allergy. A handwritten instruction was sent to the kitchen asking that shrimp be added to his plate. I am holding that note in my hand. My grandson is safe, the EpiPen is with me, and the kitchen has been alerted. I would like to know who sent this instruction. The ballroom did that thing rooms do when they stop pretending. Laughter dropped, silverware stopped moving, heads turned in a slow wave. I did not scan for allies. I looked only at the truth in my palm and the small boy at my side. Mason reached us in 4 long steps with worry written across his face. He asked what exactly was happening and whether someone was playing a prank. I told him it was not a prank and invited him to read the card. He took it, and the color changed in his cheeks as he read the words. He looked from the note to Jamie to me, and then over my shoulder toward the head table, where Nina had already started moving in our direction. Nina arrived with one hand over her heart, like a person approaching a fainting friend. She said she was sure there had been a misunderstanding, and that the staff must have mixed up a guest request. She took Jamie's name into her sentence with the quickness of someone who has practiced sounding tender. I thanked her for her concern and repeated the facts. A handwritten override reached the pass. It named the child at our table. We have asked the kitchen to ignore it and to hold shrimp service while we confirm the origin. The banquet captain stood beside me with a printed ticket strip. He pointed to the timestamp of the add-on and confirmed that his expediter had flagged the conflict with the original order. He said a runner delivered the folded card from the bar and that he had asked the runner to come forward. Derek approached with his hands at his sides. He said a woman in a slate blue dress handed him the folded note near the bar and told him it was for the chef. He sounded ashamed for not knowing what was inside. I thanked him and told him he had done the right thing by speaking now. A slow murmur moved through the wedding party, and then you could see the attention land on a single figure at the edge of the bridesmaids. Kara stood rooted to the carpet while her bracelet made a small, nervous sound against the glass in her hand. She looked terrified, and 15, even though she is older than that. The captain asked gently if she would join us. She stepped forward with a tiny nod and turned her face toward me more than toward the couple. I asked if she had been handed a folded card and asked to pass it to a server. She said yes. She said she was trying to help and did not read it. She lifted her phone when I asked if there was a message and scrolled to a text from earlier that evening. It said to make sure the child at table 8 gets a special plate and to hand the slip to the nearest server. There was a timestamp. There was a name. The message came from Nina's number. Mason made a sound that I do not have a tidy word for. He asked Nina to explain the text. She smiled in a way that looked like someone pushing a heavy thing uphill. She told him she wanted Jamie to feel included and thought a special plate might be a sweet surprise and that she had no idea there was an allergy note on file. She turned to the room and said maybe the kitchen misunderstood and that perhaps someone was trying to embarrass her. Then she glanced at Tessa and said, "Jealousy can make people invent stories." The accusation was not loud. It was shaped to land like a seed. Tessa did not take the bait. She laid her hand on Jamie's shoulder and looked at the captain. The captain addressed the room in the clear tone professionals use when they need people to listen. He told the servers to remove all shrimp from circulation for the next 10 minutes and announced that the main course at table 8 would be plated from a separate clean pan. The trio stayed quiet. The photographer lowered her camera. People were not hungry anymore. They were curious, and they were afraid. I asked the venue manager to meet us by the foyer monitors. I said we would review the camera footage from the bar and the pass. I said if the truth supported an innocent explanation, then we would return to our seats and eat in peace. I said if the truth showed intent, we would act with the same calm we were using right now. I looked at Mason. I looked at Nina. I looked at Kara, who seemed to be shrinking inside her dress. Then I walked Jamie to Tessa and asked her to hold him while I worked. Jamie whispered that his chest felt tight from the noise. I told him we would be quiet again very soon. As we turned toward the foyer, Nina touched my forearm with a soft gasp and asked me to please not ruin the night. Her grip was light and practiced. I looked at her hand and then at her face and said, "Nights do not ruin people. Choices do." Kara made a small sound behind us that might have been a sob or a decision. She stepped forward, mouth trembling, and said she needed to say something before we watched any video. She said her sister told her what to write on the card and that she is sorry because she did not understand what she was carrying. The room drew a breath and held it. Kara's confession did not explode so much as it changed the air pressure. People shifted their weight like they were adjusting to a storm front. The banquet captain asked us to step to the foyer, where a small office had a printer and a bank of monitors. I told Tessa to stay in the ballroom with Jamie and to keep his plate clean until I returned. She answered with a steady yes and took his hand like she was anchoring a tent line. In the office, the venue manager pulled a slim drawer and produced a strip of thermal paper as pale as a receipt from a corner pharmacy. He pointed to the line we needed. There was the time. There were the words, "Child add shrimp," handwritten. There was a hash that showed it did not originate in the ordering system. The expediter had circled it in pen with a question mark and the word "ignore." I felt something inside me stand a little taller because procedure had done what it was meant to do. I thanked the staff with my whole face. Kara hovered by the door and kept apologizing in a whisper that sounded like she was apologizing to a room and not a person. The manager asked if we wanted to check the foyer camera and the corridor to the pass. I said yes, and waited while he clicked through menus with the calm of a man who has practiced this exact task for wedding squabbles and lost cufflinks. On the screen, we watched a short clip from 40 minutes earlier. Nina stood at the cocktail table by the bar, writing on a folded card with a compact pen from her clutch. She glanced over her shoulder and then handed the card to Kara, who walked it toward the service lane. The timestamp in the corner matched the thermal ticket. I asked the captain to make a copy of the still frame and staple it to the kitchen strip. He did it without a sigh. He looked tired in the way good people look when they realize they are part of someone else's lesson. I thanked him again and told him we would handle the family part. He said he would keep shrimp off the floor for the rest of the evening and would assign one server to table 8 so there were no surprises. Kara pressed her phone to her chest like it might fall apart if she loosened her hold. I asked if she would be willing to share the message that Nina had sent. Her fingers shook as she opened the thread. The text was short and clear. Make sure the child at table 8 gets a special plate. Give the slip to the nearest server. She handed me the phone, and I photographed the screen with the manager's device, so we had a time-stamped capture that did not live only on Kara's phone. Kara said she thought special meant cake or fruit. She said she did not know about the allergy, and that Nina told her the detail would be a nice touch. Mason stood very still while we worked. He is a man who tries to solve by doing, and this was not a problem that wanted a wrench. He finally asked the question that had been walking circles around the edges of my thoughts. Why would she risk this? I did not answer because I wanted to hear Nina's answer. I asked the manager to invite Nina in. She stepped through the door with a small, practiced smile that said she believed she could settle this with charm and surface calm. I placed the thermal strip on the table and slid the printed still beside it. I told her we were dealing in facts, not feelings. I pointed to the timestamps. I pointed to the handwriting on the folded card. I pointed to the text on Kara's phone. I said the kitchen had ignored the handwritten override and that Jamie was safe. I asked her to explain the intent behind the instruction. She blinked like a person who has walked into bright Sunday. She said she wanted Jamie to feel special and that her note was about presentation. She said she never meant harm and that she assumed the kitchen tracked allergies. She called it a misunderstanding and then looked at Mason to ask if he trusted her. Mason did not answer. He looked at me and then at the screen and then back at Nina. You could see a decision starting to form where denial had been living. I kept my voice even and asked a second question. I asked why she wrote the note by the bar instead of telling the captain face to face. I asked why she had told Kara to deliver it instead of carrying it herself. I asked why she chose shrimp instead of something neutral when the menu had already included a plated roast and a vegetable side. Her smile thinned to almost nothing. She said she was trying to do 3 things at once and that brides delegate. It was a tidy line that would play well in a different story. The manager cleared his throat to say there was one more clip we should see. The day before the wedding, Nina had met briefly with the catering lead. The video had no audio, but it showed her sliding a small envelope across the counter and pointing at a menu board. The manager said it looked like a vendor tip for last-minute upgrades, which happens often, and that he would need to check the ledger to confirm what it was for. Nina said she had tipped to add nicer place settings and a champagne tower. The manager said those upgrades were entered and paid on the master bill weeks ago. The small room felt smaller. Kara covered her mouth with her hand. She whispered that Nina had told her everything would be fine and that nobody would get hurt. Nina finally dropped the performance and let the irritation show. She said everything was spiraling because people were determined to paint her unkind and that nothing actually reached Jamie's plate. She said we were ruining a milestone. She said if anyone truly loved Mason, they would stop right now. There it was, the pivot to control, the pressure disguised as devotion. I thanked the staff and said we would take the conversation back to the family. I asked the captain to resume service with no shellfish anywhere near table 8 and to send Jamie a plain buttered roll from a clean basket because small, safe food helps little boys breathe. He smiled, like he understood more than his role required, and said he would handle it. In the hall, Mason put his hands on his hips and stared at the carpet. He asked Nina again why she wrote that line about shrimp. She stared back and said she wanted their life to start with something impressive, and that the wedding had already cost more than planned, and she needed it to look worth it. She said, donors judge. She said, appearances matter. I thought of my grandson and of quiet apples cut into squares and decided I was done discussing appearances. I told Mason we would be returning to the ballroom with the documents and that we would be honest. I said the truth has already entered the room, and the polite thing is to meet it where it stands. We walked back into the ballroom with the truth printed in small black letters and a single image that did not take sides. People moved aside in a soft parting like they do when a procession passes. I placed the thermal strip and the still frame on the corner of our table and asked the MC for 1 more minute. He lifted his hand and the trio settled into a low resting chord that sounded almost like breathing. I told the room we had verified the handwritten instruction, that the kitchen had rejected it, and that Jamie was safe. I said we were going to add 1 more piece for clarity and invited the venue manager to bring a short clip to the foyer monitor for anyone who needed to see it. You could feel the mood turn from gossip to record-keeping. The screen in the foyer showed Nina yesterday afternoon standing at the catering office counter. She slid a small white envelope across the surface and tapped a printed menu with one fingertip. The office camera had no sound, so the moment looked almost polite. The manager explained that envelopes arrive sometimes and can be vendor tips for rush work. He also said the upgrades referenced in the file had been paid weeks earlier and that the ledger would not show any new add-ons yesterday. He said he would audit after service. I thanked him and told the room this was not a criminal trial at a cake table. It was a family asking for the exact shape of what happened. Mason asked Nina to explain the envelope. He used the voice he used when Jamie had a fever, and he wanted the nurse to tell him the numbers. Nina drew her shoulders back and said she had tipped for service and that brides are allowed to handle details. She smiled at a few relatives in the second row, as if to recruit them into a softer reading of events. The smile did not hold. People in our family respect the way paper tells stories, and the paper on the table said more than her grin. I turned the thermal strip toward Nina so she could see the timeline and asked her again, why shrimp, why a handwritten card, and why her sister. Her eyes flicked to Kara, who stared at the carpet. Nina said they wanted to make the room look elevated because this wedding had sponsors and donors and colleagues in attendance, and the night needed to land clean. She said the last month had been heavier than she let on and that she needed the marriage to finalize so that a plan could move forward. She stopped talking the moment she heard her own words. Mason blinked. I felt my pulse slow to a steady patience. I asked her what plan required a filing with the county clerk to proceed. She tried to laugh, and the sound died before it reached anyone. She said she did not mean a plan like a scheme. She said she meant a financial plan, a consolidation, a way to get their accounts under one roof so they looked stronger to a lender. She said the timing mattered and that appearances mattered. She said none of it had anything to do with Jamie, and that the kitchen would never have plated shrimp for a child. The quiet that followed was not the quiet of agreement. It was the quiet of people lining up facts in their heads. Kara put a hand on her own collarbone like she was checking for a heartbeat. Tessa's jaw tightened just enough for me to see it. The venue manager asked if we needed anything else from him. I thanked him for his professionalism and told him we would be taking the documents with us after he made certified copies for the event file. He nodded and moved with relief back toward the service hall. The servers began to move again under the captain's instructions, and shrimp did not appear anywhere near the room. Mason faced Nina fully for the first time. He asked her what the lender had to do with their ceremony and why she needed the county stamp before Monday. He asked if she had been in his email or his bank dashboard and whether any requests had already been submitted. She said everyone merges accounts and that she had only been trying to set them up for a home they could actually afford. She said the refinance on the current place could unlock equity and that a quick draw would make the marketing project they had discussed take off. She added that bankers like to see stability and that a filed license turned the numbers from two separate stories into one. Tessa turned to me and her eyes said, "Check the mail." I felt a cold understanding settle in my stomach like a stone in a river. I told the MC we were done for now and thanked the room for their patience. I asked the captain to bring Jamie a plain roll and fruit from a clean pan and told Mason we would be going home after he said a brief thank you to the guests. He nodded and kissed Jamie's hair and looked like a man who had finally understood the shape of the test. On the way out, Kara caught my sleeve. She asked if she should tell us one more thing. I asked her to speak plainly. She said Nina had told her earlier that week that once the marriage was on paper, a bridge loan would clear and a few sticky balances would be erased because a spouse's score can help with approvals. She said she did not ask what balances. She said she did not want to know. I looked at Mason, and then at Nina, and finally at my grandson, who was tearing his roll into careful halves. I asked Nina to be very clear. I asked her what financial plan could possibly require a child to sit through a dinner that was never about him in the first place. The house was quiet when we stepped in. The kind of quiet that lets you hear the refrigerator cycle and the street 2 blocks over. Tessa set Jamie up at the kitchen table with crayons and a plate of plain pasta and stood watch while I went to the hall desk, where Mason keeps the family mail in a shallow basket. A thick window envelope sat under a stack of pizza coupons. The return address belonged to a regional bank I did not recognize. I slid it open with the old brass letter opener that used to live on my mother's desk and slid out a notice headed "Important information regarding your home equity line." I read the first paragraph twice. The letter thanked Mason for completing a co-signed arrangement in support of a secured line on his property with additional collateral pledged through a family residence. My name was printed as a co-obligor. The second page listed a draw window that started the week of the engagement party. The amount approved would pay off a credit card with a balance that was far larger than the wedding vendors had quoted, and would seed a marketing venture that had not yet produced revenue. The interest rate would float after an introductory period, and there were penalties for early closure. I sat down because it is easier to stay calm when your knees are not the first thing shaking. Mason stood under the doorway like a boy who has been called into the kitchen for a talk. He said he had meant to tell me, but the process moved fast, and Nina said the bank would not hold the rate forever. He said the plan was to pay it down with his next bonus and with wedding gifts. He said lots of couples do it this way. He told me he would never let my house be at risk and that I would never feel a single tremor from this decision. I asked why my name was on the line. He said the bank wanted additional assurance because the house equity from his property did not meet the threshold for the first draw. He said it was paperwork and that the bank explained it was common for a parent to support a refinance. I asked if anyone had explained that the line could pull against the senior residents in a worst-case scenario. He said he did not plan for worst cases. He said he planned for building a future. He sounded like a man trying to convince the room and himself at the same time. Tessa brought me a glass of water and rested her hand on my shoulder. She asked Mason to sit and breathe. Then she turned to the cabinet where we keep the folders and pulled out the one labeled Jamie. Inside were school forms and health records and a printout of the educational savings account that Grace had started the year Jamie was born. The spring statement showed a clean balance with a note about a custodial structure that named Mason as the parent owner and me as an additional view-only contact. The most recent statement showed a transfer that moved several $1,000s to a household checking account 2 days before the rehearsal dinner. I felt heat rise in my face, and then I pushed it down because anger makes people sloppy. I asked Mason if he had moved money from Jamie's account. He stared at the numbers and said he meant to replace it after the wedding because the catering minimum had jumped and the photographer wanted half up front. He said the plan was to repay the account with gifts and with a small draw from the new line, and that the money would be in Jamie's name again by the end of the month. He said he did not see another way. Tessa stood very still and then said she had something I needed to read. She went to the hall closet and reached for a small fire safe that Grace had asked me to keep for her before she died. She had handed it to me during a spring cleaning weekend and told me it contained things that would matter if anything ever felt uncertain. I never opened it because love sometimes looks like honoring a seal. Tessa brought the safe to the table and set it down between us. She said Grace had given her a small envelope with my name on it the same day and asked her to hold it until there was a day when the family needed a clear path. I took the envelope and slid out a single page with Grace's tidy printing. It said, "If anything happens, please open the safe and take this key to the bank branch where the box is held." It said the banker knew my name. It said there was a trust document and instructions that would protect Jamie's medical needs and schooling, and that those funds were not to be touched by anyone who did not sign as a trustee. It said Tessa was named as a standby guardian if Mason lost his footing. It asked me to forgive future mistakes quickly, but to defend Jamie without hesitation. At the bottom, Grace had drawn a small square that looked like a window with light coming through. I breathed in and counted to 4 and breathed out and counted to 6. Then I told Mason we would visit the bank first thing and that we would bring home copies of everything that carried our names. I told him that the educational account would be made whole within 48 hours and that the company compliance office would receive a full packet regarding the vendor emails we had seen about kickbacks and special rebates. His eyes widened at the word compliance, and then he nodded because he knew there was no other road. Tessa gathered the documents into a neat stack and labeled a new folder, Receipts. Jamie wandered in with a drawing of a kite and placed it on the table. He asked if the wedding was over. I told him the wedding was paused and that sometimes grown-ups have to check their math before they can keep a promise. He asked if promises have numbers. I told him the good ones do. I took the safe deposit key from the envelope and put it in my purse next to the EpiPen. I told Mason to sleep on the couch and to set an alarm. In the morning, we would meet a banker, and we would ask a printer to tell us the truth. The bank lobby smelled faintly like lemon polish and printer toner. We arrived just after opening, 3 people walking in a line that told the teller we were not there for a routine deposit. I handed over my ID, the safe deposit key, and Grace's letter. The manager read it with the careful attention people reserve for handwriting from the dead. He led us to a small room and rolled a thin metal drawer from the vault. Inside sat a blue folder labeled Jamie Trust and a sealed envelope with my name and the word co-trustee written in Grace's tidy script. We opened the folder and met the simple architecture of a good plan. The trust established the year Jamie turned 2 named me and Grace as co-trustees, with Mason listed as parent beneficiary for routine expenses, and Jamie as the sole beneficiary for education and medical care. A clause in the middle paragraph described restricted disbursements and required 2 trustee signatures for any withdrawal exceeding a small monthly allowance. Another clause barred marital partners of any trustee or parent from initiating transfers or directing investment changes. The language was plain, kind, and firm, the way Grace was when she taught children to hold scissors. The manager pulled a printout of the access log. He pointed to a line from the day before the wedding that recorded a denied transfer attempt from a linked account because one of the required signatures was missing and the initiator did not match a listed trustee. The audit trail included the IP address and a location tag from a device that had logged into Mason's office network. Mason looked at the paper and his mouth set into a straight line that meant he was fasting from panic and choosing remorse. He said he did not make that attempt. He said only 2 people had sat at his office desk that afternoon. He said one of them was Nina. I asked the manager to add notarized copies of the trust, the access log, and the guardianship plan naming Tessa as standby guardian if Mason became unable to protect Jamie's welfare. The manager offered to call the bank's legal liaison to advise on securing the accounts. I asked him to freeze any non-trustee-initiated action and to set alerts on any login that did not match my device or the bank branch. He nodded and placed the call. The room felt steadier with each piece of paper that moved from abstract to copy-stamped. Tessa sat with the guardianship document in her lap and kept her breathing calm. She read the section where Grace explained why Tessa was named. It said, "Love is a practice, and family is a choice you make again and again." It said Tessa had shown up when she did not have to, and that kind of showing up is what children need when storms come. Tessa pressed her lips together and asked for the file numbers we would need for court if today became court. The manager provided a sheet with a case-style header and a list of document IDs. I tucked it into the new folder labeled Receipts alongside the kitchen strip and the still frame from the venue. Back at the house, we made coffee strong enough to hold our hands steady. I called Mason's company compliance office and requested an appointment for that afternoon. I forwarded the email thread showing the vendor's rebate schedule and the messages where Nina arranged event packages through Mason's division. The compliance officer wrote back quickly and asked that we bring the documents and an external drive with the camera stills and the bank logs. She attached a notice reminding employees of the gifts and gratuities policy with a bright line around third-party kickbacks. I thanked her and added the email to the folder. On the dining table, we laid out the timeline. The engagement date sat beside the first lender inquiry. The co-signed line drew a line to the draw window. The text to Kara matched the moment the note reached the kitchen. The denied trust transfer attempt landed on the same calendar square as the vendor's upgrade envelope. It was not a criminal board with red string. It was a family calendar with too many pins on the days where people were supposed to be picking out songs. Mason asked if we would ever forgive him. I told him, forgiveness is a road you walk while you carry boxes. You do not get to put the boxes down until the papers are back where they belong and the child is safe. He nodded and said he would call the educational savings custodian to reverse the transfer and would add a personal penalty that he would pay into the trust so the balance grew rather than merely returned. He said he would email his manager to step back from signing authority while the company reviewed the vendor emails. He was not a man who liked paperwork, but he was learning that paperwork is how adults tell the truth to each other. Jamie wandered in with a cape made from a dish towel clipped to his collar. He asked if we were superheroes. I told him we were librarians. Superheroes make a mess and vanish. Librarians put everything back on the correct shelf so people can find what they need when they need it. He thought about that and nodded because it sounded like the kind of hero who still makes dinner. At noon, the county clerk called back. The woman on the line confirmed that Nina had filed the ceremony's signature the evening of the reception. She said we could petition for an annulment if fraud or coercion could be shown, and recommended we request the reception security footage be preserved for the record. I thanked her and hung up and looked at the stack of paper that had shifted the ground under our feet. The story was not finished, but it was printed, stamped, and placed in order. We had a path, and the path had numbers. We gathered the folder and our courage and drove toward the compliance office, where the next room of adults would read the words and make their part of the truth known. The fellowship hall at our church always smells like coffee and cinnamon rolls, no matter what hour it island. The tables were covered with floral vinyl, and every casserole had someone's grandmother written all over it. People came to this monthly potluck for macaroni and for mercy. I asked the coordinator for 5 minutes on the microphone after announcements, and she handed it to me like she was passing a candle to a steady hand. I did not give a speech. I gave a timeline. I held up the kitchen strip with the timestamp for the handwritten add-on, the still frame that showed the card handoff, and the text that said to make sure the child at table 8 gets a special plate. I described the bank log that recorded a denied attempt on Jamie's trust the day before the wedding, and explained the clause that requires 2 of trustees and bar's spouses from initiating transfers. I told them the venue ignored the override and that Jamie was safe because safety is what happens when professionals do their jobs and families refuse to look away. The room was very quiet. A spoon clinked against a bowl in the back and then stopped. I said this out loud because I needed to hear it outside my own head. We are not here to humiliate anyone. We are here to set a boundary with light. This is about a child's health. This is about stewardship. This is about what it means to be a family that can be trusted with both casseroles and accounts. I thanked the volunteers for keeping the coffee hot and the doors open. Then I stepped back from the microphone so the paper could do the talking. People came forward and read the dates and the names and the notes with their own eyes. Mason stood beside me in a blue sweater that made him look like the coach of a tired team. He asked for the microphone and said he had failed to protect his son from a mess he created by trusting appearances over process. He said he would be restoring Jamie's education savings with penalties that he would pay personally, and that he had stepped back from signing authority at work while a review took place. He looked at his son sitting with Tessa near the cookie table and said, "I am sorry," in a voice that made several men in the room wipe their eyes with the backs of their hands. Nina was not there. Her mother was. She arrived late with a plastic bakery box and a face that had been practicing a story. Halfway through the reading of the trust clause, she stood up and said that no one had the right to drag a private matter into a church basement. She said her daughter would never hurt a child and that everyone was piling on because success makes people jealous. The pastor lifted a hand and asked for gentleness. I said we were being gentle. We had not named anyone as a criminal. We had named timestamps and policies. We had named a little boy who needed adults to stop talking about optics and start talking about oxygen. After announcements ended, people moved in small circles that looked like constellations forming. A cousin from Nina's side approached and told me she had been asked for a short-term loan in the spring with promises of being paid back after the wedding because sponsors would be generous. She showed me a message with a number in it that matched the first draw on the home equity line. A man from Mason's office told him the vendor who catered the wedding had a reputation for creative rebates and that compliance would be interested. A retired bookkeeper from the church offered to help us prepare an easy packet of receipts for court, so a judge would not have to guess. I thanked the cousin for her courage and told the bookkeeper that checklists are a love language. I poured coffee for Nina's mother because I am a person who believes in serving when I am angry. She would not meet my eyes. She asked where Nina was supposed to live if this marriage was called off. I said there are 100 places a person can live while they learn how to live well. I smiled because sometimes a smile is a truth you put on like a coat so you do not freeze. The pastor asked if we wanted mediation. I said we wanted accountability. He nodded and said sometimes those are the same road, and sometimes they are streets that never meet. He asked if he could pray for Jamie and for everyone who would read the paperwork in the next few days. We bowed our heads, and the sound of the room settled into a low hum that felt like people choosing to be decent. When we lifted our heads, the coordinator announced dessert, and the kids ran for the brownies because kids are built to find sweetness even on complicated afternoons. Tessa walked Jamie to the car with a square of cake wrapped in a napkin. Mason carried the folder marked receipts like it contained something fragile, which it did. As we reached the parking lot, my phone buzzed with an email from his company. The subject line said, "Compliance review scheduled," and the body listed a time for the next day with the audit chair and counsel. It asked that we bring originals and any media on a portable drive. It also noted that the vendor's access badge had been deactivated. I read the message twice and handed the phone to Mason. He swallowed and nodded. He understood that the next room would not be a potluck. It would be a room where adults sit with the facts until the facts do their work. We drove home under a sky that had finally decided to be blue. Tessa rolled down the back window so Jamie could let his hand surf the air. He asked if the church people were mad at us. I told him they were grateful for the chance to be good neighbors. He asked if that made us good neighbors too. I said it made us the kind of people who put everything back on the right shelf. He laughed and said librarians again, and I felt something in my chest unclench. The email from compliance sat like a postcard on the kitchen counter. We sharpened pencils and packed the folder and made sandwiches. Tomorrow would be for suits and conference rooms and lights that make everyone look pale. Tonight would be for plain food and early sleep, and a child humming to himself while he drew a kite with a brighter tail. The compliance conference room was colder than the lobby and bright enough to make every paper look like it had something to confess. A long table held pitchers of water, a neat stack of tissues, and 3 nameplates that read Audit Chair, Corporate Counsel, and Human Resources. Mason and I sat on one side with our folder labeled Receipts, and the compliance officer who had emailed us placed a small recorder on the table and said the session would be memorialized for the file. She began by reminding us of the policy on gifts and gratuities and the code of conduct about vendor relationships. Then she asked Mason to walk through the last 6 months of event spending in his division. Mason kept his eyes on the printed calendar and told the truth. He described how Nina had offered to help coordinate off-site events because she said she knew hospitality well. He acknowledged that he had allowed her to make introductions to 2 vendors, including the caterer who handled the wedding. He admitted that he had not disclosed the personal relationship at the time because he believed personal and professional lines were clear in his mind and he did not expect them to cross. Corporate counsel asked for the portable drive. I slid it across and explained what each folder contained. One folder held the vendor's rebate schedule that referenced personal cashback for event packages signed under Mason's division. Another contained the email thread where Nina arranged menu tiers and requested a side ledger that tracked a percentage separate from the master invoice. A third folder contained still frames from the venue camera showing Nina meeting the catering lead the day before the wedding, and a fourth contained the bank's denial log tied to a transfer attempt on Jamie's trust. The counsel asked why a trust log mattered to a corporate review. I said it established a pattern of pressure around the wedding weekend and explained the motive behind urgent filings and side deals. He nodded without committing to an opinion and slid the printouts into a tidy stack. Audit Chair turned to Mason and asked if he had ever benefited personally from vendor rebates. Mason answered no. He said he had never taken a gift beyond a branded pen and a cup of coffee, and that he had revoked his signing authority yesterday until the review finished. He explained that he had learned that the caterer offered personal bonuses to Nina for steering company events to them, and that he was sick to his stomach to hear it in those words. He said he was ready to answer any question and accept the outcome. HR asked about workplace access. The compliance officer confirmed that Nina's guest badge had been deactivated and that she was no longer permitted on the premises. She noted that any contact with employees about the review would be considered interference and referred to counsel. She asked Mason if he felt safe from retaliation. He said he did and requested that any communications from Nina be routed to counsel rather than to his inbox. She wrote it down and thanked him for being specific. Audit chair opened the vendor contract file and called the catering lead in by video. The man appeared on screen in an office with a row of chafing dishes behind him like a silver parade. He admitted that he had offered personal bonuses to Nina on any corporate events she helped land, and that he had discussed a side percentage that would be paid through a third-party service. He said he did not consider it a bribe, only a finder's fee common in the industry. Corporate counsel replied that the company did not consider it common at all, and that the contract language prohibited it. He told the vendor that the relationship would be suspended pending a board decision. The compliance officer played the foyer clip from the venue. Nina stood at the counter, slid a small envelope across the surface, and tapped a menu. The officer paused the video and asked the vendor what the envelope was for. He said it was a thank you. She asked him to say thank you to whom. He said to him personally. She wrote a note, thanked him for his time, and ended the call. Audit chair summarized. A personal relationship was not disclosed. A vendor offered personal rebates in exchange for corporate events. An event associated with that vendor intersected with family conduct that raised safety concerns for a minor. The chair said the panel would recommend termination of the vendor relationship, referral of the rebate matter to outside counsel, and internal ethics training for everyone in Mason's division. He commended Mason for stepping back from signatory authority and said the board would consider a formal reprimand for failures of oversight. He looked at me and asked if we needed a statement on workplace boundaries to support Jamie's safety. I said a no-contact directive would help. HR drafted a letter that barred Nina from contacting Mason at work or using company channels to reach any member of his family. They handed the letter across the table for Mason's signature and countersigned it on the spot. Mason exhaled like a tire releasing air. He thanked the panel for taking the matter seriously and said he would cooperate with any next step. The compliance officer slid a copy of the signed letter into an envelope addressed to our home. She asked if there were any additional materials we wanted in the record. I added a one-page timeline that placed the denied trust transfer attempt next to the vendor envelope and the kitchen slip. I said the company did not have to rule on family, but understanding pressure helps explain decisions. The officer said context is not an excuse, but it is information, and thanked me for organizing it for them. When we stood, HR touched my elbow and said she was a grandmother too. She told me that companies rely on adults in rooms like this. People who bring receipts, people who speak without heat, people who keep children safe by insisting that ethics is not a slogan. I felt my eyes sting and I nodded because I did not have a better reply. We left with our folder a little thicker and the sense that one part of the work had been seen by strangers who chose to be responsible. In the parking lot, Mason stared at the steering wheel. He said he could not believe he had nearly tied his work to a personal mess that would have followed him for years. I told him we were not done yet. I told him the next room belonged to a judge and that the papers we carried would help a different kind of panel draw a line where a home needed one. He nodded, turned the key, and drove us toward the courthouse, where the story would have to wear a suit and answer the questions in an even voice. The county clerk's office sits inside a building that smells like paper and old polish. A clerk behind a glass window pulled up the record and confirmed in a careful voice that the ceremony signature had been filed the night of the reception. She printed a certified copy of the filing and slid it under the window with a receipt. The paper felt both thin and heavy. She explained that an annulment could be sought if a judge found fraud or coercion, and she suggested we request preservation of the venue's security footage. I thanked her and asked for the form. She handed me a one-page request, and I filled it out with hands that had learned to be steady. When we got home, there was a letter from an attorney addressed to Mason. The tone was brisk. It warned against defamation and reminded him that a prenuptial agreement took effect upon the county filing. It said any public statements that harmed Nina's reputation would be met with swift action. Mason read it twice and looked at me like a man who has realized the trail he took also had traps. I told him a letter is not a verdict. It is a move in a game that our family would not be playing with gossip. We would play it with records. We brought the packet to a family attorney recommended by the bookkeeper from church. The office was lined with diplomas and framed kid drawings. The lawyer read the trust clauses, the denied transfer log, the kitchen strip, and the compliance notes like a person assembling scaffolding. Then she read the prenup that Nina had filed. It was drafted broadly. It gave Nina discretionary authority over household budgets and permitted her to direct certain spending categories as a partner in a blended income home. It made no mention of Jamie's trust and did not attach schedules for separate property. It did not limit access to custodial accounts beyond vague language about supporting the child's needs. The lawyer tapped the trust clause that barred spouses from initiating transfers and nodded at the guardianship plan that named Tessa as standby. She said, "I had stronger rails than most families bring into her office." She said the record showed a rush to formalize the marriage while side deals and vendor rebates were being arranged. She said a judge would care about process more than about feelings, and that our papers told a clear story about process. She suggested we file for an annulment based on fraud, seek a temporary protective order for Jamie, and request interim financial controls to secure the education account and the house line. Mason asked if the prenup meant Nina could walk into a court and control his budget. The lawyer smiled like a person who has read hundreds of contracts and told him that a judge reads words for what they say and also for what they do not say. She pointed again to the trust and to the guardianship plan. She said the court's first obligation is the safety of the child and the integrity of restricted funds. She said we would ask the court to enforce what Grace wrote and to set aside what Nina drafted. She said the video of the bar handoff and the time-stamped kitchen strip would help a judge see intent where a dinner invitation tried to hide it. We left with a checklist and a filing calendar. Back at the house, I emailed the venue manager to preserve the foyer and pass footage and received a confirmation that copies would be ready for pickup by morning. Tessa began to assemble a binder with tabs for every section a judge might ask to see. She labeled one section, Family History, so the court would understand how Jamie had lived since Grace died. She labeled another section, Financial Pressure, and placed within it the home equity notice, the denied trust log, and a printout of the vendor rebate email. Near sunset, a text pinged on Mason's phone from an unknown number. It said the marriage was now official and that he should move the remainder of his accounts by Monday. It said optics mattered and that loyal partners act quickly. Mason looked at me and then at the binder and then at his son, who was building a small town out of blocks in the living room. He set the phone face down and said he was done confusing speed with commitment. Tessa made tea and handed me a cup. She asked what comes next. I told her we would go to court and ask for light. I told her we would ask a judge to hold the papers up to that light and decide what they mean. I told her that truth is patient, but deadlines are not, so tonight we would sleep and tomorrow we would file. I tucked the clerk's certified copy into the front sleeve of the binder and snapped it shut. At the edge of sleep, I heard Jamie call from his room, and I went to sit on the floor next to his bed. He asked if we were safe. I told him that safety looks like grown-ups who keep promises with paper. He asked if paper could be brave. I told him paper is only as brave as the people who bring it into rooms and speak plainly. He turned his face into the pillow and breathed the way children do when they decide to rest. In the morning, we would stand in front of a judge. In the morning, the story would answer questions without flinching. In the morning, the binder would open, and the room would be very bright. The boardroom looked like a place where people believed in straight lines, long walnut table, framed ethics statements in black frames, a small clock that did not hurry for anyone. The audit chair sat at the head and asked everyone to introduce themselves for the record. Corporate counsel adjusted his glasses and clicked a pen. The compliance officer placed a stack of binders in front of each nameplate and set a small recorder within reach. Human resources poured water into short glasses that chimed when set on the coaster. Counsel began by summarizing the written record. A personal relationship had not been disclosed. A vendor offered personal rebates in exchange for corporate events. A wedding managed by the same vendor intersected with a family safety incident that led to a food service override request rejected by venue procedures. He noted that intent at the wedding was not the board's purview. He said pressure surrounding the event explained why the company was seeing the vendor relationship in a harsh light. He asked the compliance officer to show the short clip again. The foyer camera filled the wall monitor. Nina slid a white envelope to the catering lead and tapped a printed menu. The officer paused the frame and switched to the email thread that referred to a side ledger. The vendor joined by video and admitted he had offered personal payouts to Nina for event packages tied to Mason's division. He called them customary referral bonuses. The audit chair read the contract clause aloud that prohibited any undisclosed payments, gifts, or rebates to any employee or affiliate. He asked the vendor if he had read the clause. The vendor said yes. The chair said the relationship would be terminated for cause and referred to outside counsel. The vendor did not protest. He only looked smaller in his square. HR read a summary of the no-contact letter issued after our first session and placed a signed copy in the official file. She confirmed that Nina had attempted to reach 2 employees in Mason's group since then. Both messages were forwarded directly to compliance without reply. Counsel added a memorandum recommending that any further contact go through legal and that building security maintain the badge deactivation for all locations. The chair initialed the margin and nodded for the next item. The compliance officer turned to Mason and asked if he wished to add anything. Mason stood. His voice was clear and a little raw. He said he had failed to draw a boundary between his home and his job. He said his division had not paid above market prices for the events, but the method of securing them broke policy. He said he had stepped back from signing authority and requested ethics training for his team so that no one learned these lessons the way he did. He did not defend himself. He told the truth and sat down. Counsel asked me to speak briefly for the record regarding the family safety incident because it had been referenced without detail. I stated the facts with no heat. A handwritten instruction attempted to add shellfish to a child's plate at table 8. The child had a documented life-threatening allergy. The kitchen rejected the instruction. The note had been handed off near the bar by a runner who identified the messenger and the writer on the venue camera. The child remained safe because venue procedures held and because we asked for the paper that told the story. The chair thanked me and said the clarity mattered because it gave the board the right scale for the company's concern. An assistant stepped in with a printed update. Counsel read it and looked up. Nina had texted Kara during the meeting. The message asked her to recant her earlier statement and to say that she had fabricated the handoff out of jealousy. The text promised a cash thank you once the investigation ended. HR lifted her eyebrows and asked for a screenshot. Within minutes, Kara forwarded it. The chair asked the officer to enter it into the file under interference and retaliation. The room went silent in the way rooms do when people witness the exact behavior that proves the case. The chair delivered the decision in a voice that did not perform. The company would terminate the vendor relationship for cause. The matter of personal rebates would be sent to outside counsel and to the executive committee for disciplinary action where appropriate. Mason would receive a formal reprimand for failure to disclose a personal relationship and for allowing a vendor to communicate through a non-employee. His signing authority would remain suspended until the committee completed its review, and ethics training would be mandatory for all managers in the division. HR would extend the no-contact directive to include any family member and would notify Nina's counsel that attempts to influence witnesses had been recorded and preserved. There was no applause. There was only the sound of pens moving as people signed their names under the word approved. When we stepped into the corridor, the compliance officer handed me a copy of the written decision for our binder. She told me that sometimes accountability arrives late, and all at once. She said to take the evening and rest if I could. Mason nodded and said thank you like a man who had been given the gift of a second chance he would not waste. In the parking garage, my phone buzzed. Kara had sent the screenshot of Nina's message and a short line that said, "I am done lying." She added that Nina had asked her for a bank transfer last week to cover a past due account and promised it would all be paid back once the marriage papers matured. Kara said she had saved the text about the transfer too. I thanked her and told her we would bring everything to the judge in the morning. I told her she had done the brave thing, and that brave does not always feel good on the first day. We drove home under a sky that had shifted to the softer blue that comes before evening. Tessa warmed soup and set the table without asking what the decision was because she could read it on our faces. Jamie climbed into my lap and asked if we were finished. I kissed his hair and told him almost. One more room, one more bright light, one more stack of paper placed in patient hands. He asked if the judge liked librarians. I told him judges love people who put everything back where it belongs. He leaned his head against my shoulder and watched the steam lift from his bowl in a slow ribbon. Tomorrow would be court. Tonight would be soup and a story about a kite that keeps finding wind. Family court smelled like fresh envelopes and old patience. The judge entered with a small nod that quieted the room without effort. We sat at the petitioner table with our binder open to tabs that Tessa had labeled in careful block letters. Across from us, Nina sat with her attorney. Kara waited on a bench near the aisle with a handkerchief in her fist, like a promise she intended to keep. Our lawyer began with the story told by paper. She handed up the kitchen strip with the timestamp and the notation that the expediter wrote when he ignored the handwritten override. She placed the still frame from the foyer camera beside it. She added the text from Nina to Kara with the instruction about a special plate for the child at table 8. The judge studied the exhibits and asked the clerk to mark them. The room did not need music to understand rhythm. Each page landed with a sound that felt like a small door closing. Next came the trust. The lawyer read the clause that barred spouses from initiating transfers and the clause that required 2 trustees for any withdrawal beyond a small allowance. She handed up the denied transfer log with the device location that matched Mason's office network the day before the wedding. She placed the guardianship plan that named me as co-trustee and named Tessa as standby guardian if Mason could not keep Jamie safe. The judge asked if the trust funds had been used for wedding expenses. Our lawyer answered no. She said the system refused the attempt because the rules Grace wrote were stronger than the pressure of a single weekend. The judge asked Mason to stand and speak. He did. He said he had allowed loneliness to blur his judgment. He said he had moved money from Jamie's education account and had already arranged to restore the full amount with a penalty he would pay into the trust. He said he had stepped back from signing authority at work. He said he would accept any reasonable instruction the court gave to ensure that Jamie would never again be put at risk by an adult's hurry. Then Kara stood. Her voice shook, but the words did not. She said Nina handed her a folded card at the bar and told her to deliver it to a server for the chef. She said she did not read it and that she would never have carried it if she had known about the allergy. She said Nina texted her after the corporate review and asked her to recant and promised a cash thank you. She handed up the screenshot. The judge's eyebrows lifted by the smallest measure and then settled again. Nina's attorney tried to call all of it a misunderstanding. He said no shrimp reached the child's plate. He said the kitchen did the right thing and that no harm occurred. He said the envelope at the vendor office was a customary tip. He said the prenuptial agreement granted Nina authority over budgets once filed with the county and that her interest in consolidating accounts was ordinary. The judge looked at the prenup and then at the trust. She asked one question that made the room lean forward. She asked whether ordinary planning includes a handwritten card that attempts to change a child's plate in secret. The attorney said the card was unfortunate. The judge wrote a note and did not look up while she finished the line. Our lawyer closed with a request for clarity. She asked for an annulment based on fraud and coercion. She asked for a temporary protective order for Jamie. She asked for an order returning the educational account to the prior balance with an added good faith penalty to be paid by Mason into the trust. She asked for a stay on any action related to the home equity line that used my residence as collateral until the refinance could be reviewed. She asked for a no-contact directive that barred Nina from contacting Jamie at school or at home and required all communication with Mason to flow through counsel. The judge removed her glasses and set them beside her notes. She spoke in a voice that made even the air feel organized. The marriage would be annulled. The petition had shown a pattern of pressure that began before the ceremony and continued through the filing with the county. The court would enter a temporary protective order in favor of Jamie. The educational account would be restored within 48 hours with an additional contribution equal to 10% of the withdrawn amount paid into the trust by Mason. The home equity line would be placed under immediate review, and any draw would require court permission until the review concluded. A no-contact directive would issue. Any attempt to influence witnesses would be preserved for any future proceeding. The judge thanked Kara for her courage and told her that stopping a lie is also a form of care. Nina stared at the table. For a moment she looked like a person who had walked to the edge of a choice and discovered that the ground does not move to meet you. Her attorney asked for a brief recess and the judge declined. The clerk stamped the orders and handed copies across the rail. paper again, thin and heavy at the same time. Outside on the courthouse steps, the wind flipped the edges of our copies like a child playing with pages. Mason knelt so he could look Jamie in the eye. He said he was sorry for building a plan that forgot the first rule of family. He said the first rule is safety. He said the second rule is telling the truth the first time. Jamie nodded and reached for my hand. Tessa wrapped her arm around both of them and then looked at me like someone who knows what it costs to keep steady. We went home and taped the protective order and the annulment to the inside of the trust folder. I hung a bright case for the EpiPen on the kitchen wall where Jamie could see it but not reach it without a stool. Tessa took Jamie to the park and showed him how to hold the string of a simple kite so it would climb without jerking. He laughed when the tail snapped and then leveled and then rose. Mason called the educational savings custodian and made the transfer while I listened. He called the bank to place a hold on the line that touched my house and confirmed the review had been logged. That night I sat by the window and watched the porch light draw a soft circle on the steps. I thought about Grace's letter and the sentence about defending Jamie without hesitation. I thought about Nina and the way appearances can swallow a person who thinks applause is the same as love. I thought about paper and how it cannot love you, but it can hold you up while you do the loving. I whispered thank you to a room that had held all of us while we learned. When Tessa came in, she had grass on her shoes and a tired smile. Jamie was asleep on her shoulder in the loose way children sleep when they understand that the adults have finally picked up the right boxes. We laid him down and turned off the lamp. The house felt steady again. Not perfect, honest. The kind of steady that leaves room for breakfast and homework and a new habit of checking the mail before the coupons bury the letters that matter. In the morning, we would begin the quiet work of repair. Tonight, we were simply a family that had chosen to stand between a child and a storm.